Buon tarde. This morning you heard from Professor Nelson the outline of and the structure of the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. And what I'm going to do this afternoon is I'm going to provide you with an overview of some of the key findings that we have had in a certain set of areas. I was trying to think of a word that you might understand. I don't know if you know the word smorgasbord or buffet, but think of this as a buffet of some of the measures that we have assessed over the last 20 years. And it will give you a sense about the pattern of findings, and I'll go into them in some detail. Let me set the stage for this talk. In the mid-1990s, there was a meeting at the White House in Washington, D.C. that was called by then First Lady Hillary Clinton for a meeting about early childhood and the effects of the brain on early child development. As a result of that meeting, there was great interest in the public about the effects of early experience on brain development. There's a foundation called the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, which is headquartered in Chicago, asked Professor Nelson to organize a group of scientists, half of them neuroscientists who study rodents, rats and mice, birds, and non-human primates, monkeys, and half of them psychologists and psychiatrists who study infant and child development. And he organized this group so that they could come together to discuss the issues about a common language that could be created between the neuroscientists and the developmental psychologists with regard to issues about child development. And this group met for about 10 years. And actually, the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, which you heard a little bit about this morning, and you'll hear more about tomorrow, was an outgrowth of this particular group. It was called a Working Group in Early Experience and Brain Development. As a result of that working group, one of the members of that working group, Jack Shonkoff, who is a pediatrician, organized at the end of that working group a group of scientists, some from that early experience and brain development working group, and some from another group that he had worked with for the National Academy of Sciences to create a book called From Neurons to Neighborhood. He organized a group called the National Scientific Council for the Developing Child. And the purpose of that group was to create a common language that can be communicated to practitioners and to policymakers about what we know about brain development in early childhood from really from birth through the first 3 to 5 years of life. And so the talk that I'm going to give you this afternoon is a talk presenting what is called the core story or the core principles that have been developed by the National Scientific Council for the Developing Child. And I'm going to go through what all of those principles are. Okay. So there are 3 core concepts of development for healthy child development. The first is that brain architecture is established early in life and supports lifelong learning, behavior, and health. The second is that stable, caring relationships and serve and return interaction shape brain architecture. I'll go through each of these core principles in just a moment. I'm going to give you all three right now. And the third is that toxic stress in the early years of life can derail healthy development. So let's go to the first principle, which is experiences build brain architecture. I should say that one of the things that the council, the group of scientists in the council did, and with Jack, is we worked with an organization called Frameworks, which was a group of linguists and cultural anthropologists who could help us translate the science and use appropriate metaphors to be able to communicate the science to policy people and to practitioners. So for example, and I'll point out, I'll highlight those metaphors as I go through my talk. So for example, the first metaphor is architecture, right? When you think about architecture, you think about design and building a structure, a house, a building, right? And so when we talk about brain development, we're talking about brain architecture, or the blueprints and the structure and the strategy that an architect would use in order to create a brain. Okay, so first concept, brain architecture supports lifelong learning, behavior, and health. Notion is that brains are built over time, starting in the earliest years of life. Simple skills come first, more complex skills are built on top of them. Think about if you're building a house, the first thing that you would do, or a building, the first thing that you would do is you'd lay the foundation. You put the foundation down, put the beams up, and then you put the walls up, then you put the wiring in, and then you finish off the house. So brain development is very much like that. You have to start with a basic foundation, and then over time, simple skills beget more complex skills, and that they are layered one on top of the other. Cognitive, emotional, and social capabilities are inextricably intertwined throughout the life course. It used to be that in psychology, we studied cognition and emotion and social development separately, but now we realize that all three of them are inextricably intertwined, particularly in the early years of life. You cannot talk about the child's intellectual development early in life without talking about the child's social development. And the final part of that principle is that a strong foundation in the early years improves the odds for positive outcomes, and a weak foundation increases the odds of later difficulties. Now, I'm going to show you in my next PowerPoint slide, a slide that Professor Nelson showed you earlier, and I'm showing it to you also because it's one of my favorite slides. It is the idea that the ability of brains to change decreases over time. So the first thing that you can see here is that brain plasticity changes with age. There are some of us, can you all hear me? There are some of us who are on this side. And some of you may be lucky enough to be more on this side. If you're on that side, then in terms of the plasticity of brain development, you have greater plasticity. As you get older, that plasticity decreases. It doesn't go away, but it does decrease. So my ability, as I spend more and more time here in Brazil, to learn Portuguese is still going to be quite difficult and quite hard, compared to if I'd come here as a child and had learned the language. And that is because the physiological effort that the brain must use in order to learn and in order for this plasticity to take effect becomes more and more difficult. It becomes more and more difficult to learn skills as we get older. Not that it's impossible, but it just is obviously more difficult. Now, another principle of brain architecture is that neural circuits are wired in a bottom-up sequence. Remember I said that you start out with simple skills and then you build upon that to have more complex skills. What you see here on the x-axis are a child's age first in months and then in years. And what the curves represent is they represent the changes in brain connectivity, in the synapses in the brain, during different periods of development. Neurologists used to think that the brain developed, every part of the brain developed at the same time. They now know that that is incorrect, and that in fact, different parts of the brain and different skills, obviously, develop at different rates and at different ages. So in the earliest stages of development, of brain development, the areas of the brain that are associated with sensory information, vision, audition, and touch, those are the ones that develop first. What happens next is that the skills that are associated with language come on board, right? A little bit earlier, a little bit later in development. And then much later, and for a more protracted period of time, for a longer period of time, all of the cognitive and intellectual skills that we think about are developing. And you can see here that in that pink bar there, that this is where in that first years of life that you're getting the development of the sensory skills and the language skills, and also the development of the synapses and the connections in the brain that are associated with basic cognitive skills as well. Okay, this is an illustrative slide for you of another principle of brain architecture and its development. This is a slice of an area of the brain from a baby at around 6 months of age. And now what I'm going to show you is that same area from a child at 6 years of age. All right, and what do you see? You see here that in between 6 months of age or birth and early infancy and early childhood, there are tremendous number of connections in this area of the brain that have occurred. These are synapses that are connecting with each other in this particular part of the brain. But now, look what happens by age 14. What you see here in this same area of the brain, that the connections, at least some of these connections, have been lost. Now, neuroscientists like to think of themselves as gardeners, right? People who work in the garden. And so they have metaphors for this. They call the first part of brain development the blooming of synapses, that is the proliferation of these synapses, the blooming of the synapses. And then they call this part losing those synapses, right? And so those synapses go away. Now, why does that happen? Why do those synapses, some of those synapses disappear? My favorite analogy is to learning to ride a bicycle. at least in the United States, when I taught my children how to ride a bicycle, when they first started, they had training wheels. I don't know if you have that in Brazil. Yes, you do. Great. Okay. So you start out riding your bicycle and you have training wheels, and that helps you, right? But once you know how to balance, and once you know how to pedal, and once you know how to keep yourself going, then you can take the training wheels off, right? It's the same thing in brain development. When you're learning skills, you need lots of synapses in order to support those skills. But once you have mastered those skills, once they have become automatic, those synapses, or at least some of those synapses, can fall away. And that's what we see happening here in terms of brain architecture and brain development. Okay, so now on to sensitive periods. What do we know about sensitive periods? As Professor Nelson told you earlier this morning, they are limited time periods during which the effect of early experience on the brain is particularly strong. They allow experience to instruct neural circuits to process information in an adaptive way, and they provide information that is essential for normal development and may alter performance permanently. Professor Nelson also showed you this figure, so I won't spend much time on it, only to show you, there you can see those different periods. Those are the periods of synaptic development, and each one of those can be considered a critical period during which the effect of experience has a particularly strong effect on brain development. Okay, now we didn't always used to call them sensitive periods. In fact, before neuroscientists talked about sensitive periods, ethologists called it imprinting. Some of you may recognize this picture from your psychology textbooks. This is Konrad Lorenz, who was an ethologist, and what he discovered is that when a baby duckling is hatched, it will follow the first thing that it sees moving. Now, usually what it sees is its mother, and so baby ducklings will follow the mother. But what Lorenz did is he made sure that he was the first thing that the baby duckling saw, and so what you could see there is all the baby ducklings following Lorenz. That was called imprinting, but you can think about that when you think about sensitive periods in brain development. It's a critical time during which experience has a profound effect upon the brain. Now, when neuroscientists studied it, the first neuroscientists to really describe it accurately were two neuroscientists at MIT, Hubel and Wiesel. They actually won the Nobel Prize for this. And what they did is they studied kittens and then non-human primates, and they studied the visual system. And what they were interested in was in seeing whether or not early visual experience affected the brain and whether they can manipulate it. And so what they did is they raised baby kittens in the dark, or they closed one eye of a baby kitten so they only had visual information from one eye. And what they saw, you can see the figure called A is normal visual cortex. It's called striate cortex because they're stripes. And B is what that cortex, what that area in the brain looks like in a kitten that is deprived in one eye of visual information. Now, it wasn't only the type of experience that Hubel and Wiesel were interested in, they were also interested in the timing of visual experience. So if the timing of visual experience occurred either too early or too late, then the brain in the visual area did not organize in the appropriate way. Again, the neuroscience example of a sensitive period. There's actually a human example of that. This is a work by a developmental psychologist by the name of Daphne Maurer. It's a picture of her down there. She's at McMaster University in Canada. And what she recognized the Hubel and Wiesel work, and what she did is she studied babies that were born with bilateral cataracts so that they could not see pattern vision when they were born. And now, at the time, the neuro-ophthalmologists, the surgeons, did not know how early they could operate and remove the cataracts from the babies. And so she had a natural experiment. She had some babies who had the surgery early, and some babies who did not have the surgery until later in life. Very much like the kittens in Hubel and Wiesel's study. And what she found was, in fact, that the time at which the babies got the surgery, the later that they got it, the worse the visual perception was of those babies later on in life. There's another example. This is Janet Worker, who is another developmental psychologist, also from Canada. She's at the University of British Columbia. And what she has shown is that the timing of language is important. The timing at which a baby hears language is very important in terms of their brain development. So very early in life, babies can identify the differences within a language across all the languages in the world. But as they get older and they only hear their own language, then that ability disappears. It's called perceptual narrowing. And so what she found is that at around 9 or 10 months of age, that perceptual narrowing in the brain occurs so that babies can no longer identify all different languages, but only the language from their own environment. Okay, so those are the examples that are associated with that first core principle called brain architecture. Now on to the second core principle, which is interaction shapes brain circuitry. Our first metaphor was brain architecture. Our second metaphor is serve and return. So the metaphor here is that serve and return builds brains and skills. Now, the people at Frameworks were probably tennis players because the metaphor comes from tennis, right? You serve a ball and you hit it back and forth, right? And so it's the principle that they are interested in illustrating, that we are interested in illustrating, is that a mom or a caregiver and a baby, they interact with each other in this serve and return way. The baby says something, the mom says something. The mom says something, the baby says something. They serve and return to each other. Now, young children naturally reach out for interaction through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures, and adults respond in kind. These serve and return interactions are essential for the development of healthy brain circuits, and therefore, if we know that, then it is important to think about the implication there. The implication is that we must support the quality of relationships in early caregiving settings, communities, and homes, because that interaction, those interactions, support the development of sturdy brain architecture. Now, there are studies that have been shown about what the environment of the baby, the language environment of the baby, what that predicts. And this is an old study, actually, from 1995 by 2 researchers who studied families from 3 different types of environments. They studied them from poor moms, they studied them from working class moms, and they studied them from college-educated parents. So these are the babies or the young babies who are living in each of these different environments. And on the y-axis is the number of words that the baby produced over age. And you can see age on the x-axis, 16 months, 24 months, and 36 months, right? And so look what happens. At 16 months, there's no difference between the babies in terms of their language production. But look what happens over time. You can see that already by 24 months of age, there is a gap between the vocabulary production of babies that are living in environments where there are ultimately what we know is more language spoken, more words that are spoken. The babies produce more words than in environments in which fewer words, in which the baby is exposed to fewer words. The final piece of this is about executive skills. And the final metaphor here is what we call an air traffic control system. So somewhere in your brain, you have to have the ability to be able to pay attention, to be able to inhibit impulses, to be able to keep more than one thing in your memory in order to get multiple things done at the same time. Nowadays, we talk about that as multitasking, right? That you're doing more than one thing at the same time. But there's an area in the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for this air traffic control system. Why do we call it an air traffic control system? Because an air traffic controller at an airport has to maintain not only one plane, but many planes that are circling around, landing, and taking off at the same time. Okay, so these skills, which are called executive function skills, help us focus on multiple streams of information at the same time, set goals, make plans, make decisions in light of available information, revise plans, and resist hasty action. And they are a key biological foundation of school readiness, as well as outcomes for health and employability. Now, what are these executive function skills? There are three that I'm going to mention. The first is called inhibitory control, and that is to be able to filter thoughts and impulses and resist temptation or distraction. There's a very famous experiment by a very famous developmental psychologist by the name of Walter Mischel, and he invented an experiment. It was called the marshmallow test. I don't know, has anybody heard of the marshmallow test here? Oh, good, some of you have. Well, basically what it is you put a marshmallow down in front of a child and you say, okay, you can have the marshmallow, but I want you to wait. I'm going to leave the room and I'm going to come back. And if you can wait, you can have the marshmallow. But if you can't wait, you have to ring the bell and I'll come back, but you won't get the marshmallow. Okay. And what Michelle found is that children who were able to wait, who were able to inhibit their impulses, they did better ultimately over the long term in school and in their professions than children who were more impulsive. The second skill is called working memory, and that is the ability to hold and manipulate information in our heads over a short period of time. Usually it's about 3 to 5 pieces of information that we are able to hold in memory at the same time. And the third skill is called cognitive flexibility, and that is the ability to change, to adapt your behavior to the changing circumstances. Now, here's the data from a longitudinal study, and what this data shows is that for outcomes like physical health and substance use, being able to have better self-control early in childhood predicts less substance use and better physical health than if you are more impulsive. And then again, interestingly enough, in this longitudinal work, you can also see that in terms of prediction of crime over into adulthood, that the less impulsive you are, the less likely you are to be convicted of crime. Okay, that's end of my second core principle. Now on to the third core principle, which is toxic stress derails healthy development. Again, the metaphor, toxic stress. Now, why did we come up with that metaphor? The reason is that when you say stress to people, we wanted to convey the importance of stress in the environment on the developing brain. But if you ask anybody whether they are stressed out, most people will say, yeah, I'm stressed out. Sometimes during the day, I get very stressed out. Sometimes my kids stress me out. Sometimes my work stresses me out. And so we had to make a distinction between normal everyday stress and chronic stress for which there is no solution. And that's how we came up with the metaphor of toxic stress. So there are 3 levels of stress. What we call positive stress, which are what people experience, and sometimes it's actually good in terms of performance. Then there's tolerable stress, which is serious stress, but if you have a buffer for that stress, you can get over it. And then there's toxic stress, which is prolonged activation of the stress responses in the absence of protective relationships. Now, what do we know about stress? We know that relationships buffer the effects of stress. And so learning how to cope with moderate, short-lived stress can build a healthy stress system. But we also know that toxic stress, when the body's response system is activated excessively, can weaken developing brain architecture. And in fact, without caring adults to buffer children, toxic stress associated with extreme poverty, neglect, abuse, or severe maternal deprivation can have long-term consequences for learning, behavior, and physical and mental development. Now, here's an illustration for you. This is a neuron, and you can see all of the dendrites and synapses that are coming off of that neuron. And here you see the same area, the same neuron, but after the animal has been subjected to chronic toxic stress. And you can see in terms of the electron micrograph, let me see, does that work? Okay. There, I just wanted to show you. There you can see that the typical neuron has many connections, and the neuron that has undergone toxic stress has many fewer connections. Okay. So, I'm almost done. I just want to say a few words about ACEs, or early childhood experiences. It is a very popular concept in the United States. Early childhood experiences, there was a study that was done by Kaiser Permanente, a big health concern in California, and it asked adults to nominate and identify a range of adverse childhood experiences, including abuse, neglect, and household challenges. And then what the researchers found is that the number of adverse events that the adult nominated was related to their physical and mental health. So, for example, the number of adverse childhood events is associated with the risk for developing cardiovascular disease. So adversity and early stress not only has an effect on the brain, but it also has an effect upon the body. The final piece is that Professor Nelson talked this morning about neglect. When we talk about infants and children who are living in institutions, they are, in fact, living in circumstances of neglect. Hopefully, they're not being physically or sexually abused, but what they are experiencing is a lack of important experiences in terms of the kinds of interactions that they should have within a family. And as you can see here in the United States, neglect is the most prevalent form of child maltreatment. Now, why should neglect be bad for the brain? Well, the brain expects to get positive experiences, and if it doesn't, then the brain architecture is not wired properly. And particularly if those experiences occur during sensitive periods, as I've described to you, then the brain's wiring can go and become maladaptive. Now, here's an example from the Bucharest study. You can see here on on my right, children from the community in terms of their brain activity, and you can see children on the other side who are from institutions. And what you can see here is that the amount of energy that the brain is producing that's in red, is significantly lower compared to typical children of the same age. Okay, so what is the answer to all of this? As we say in the United States, there are no magic bullets. Positive relationships and quality learning experiences can be promoted both at home and through a wide range of evidence-based parent education, family support, early care, and education and intervention programs. And a balanced approach to cognitive, social, cognitive, and language development will best prepare children for success in school and the later workplace. So, the effectiveness factors for early care and education programs for children from birth to age 5 are as follows: qualified and well-compensated personnel, small group sizes and high adult-to-child ratios, a language-rich environment, developmentally appropriate curriculum, a safe physical setting, and most importantly, we think, warm and responsive adult-child relationships. Science points to a two-tiered approach to reducing disparities. The first is basic health services, and good quality early care and education can promote healthy development and early detection of problems in all children. And then targeted services for children experiencing tolerable or toxic stress can reduce disruptions of the developing nervous system and immune systems that lead to later problems in learning, behavior, and development. So therefore, delivering those services, having early care, and reducing toxic stress in the environment are all important for healthy development. And finally, the takeaway messages. Significant brain development occurs in the first years of life. Healthy brain and behavioral development requires positive, sensitive, and responsive caregiving. Toxic stress can derail healthy brain development and behavioral development. Providing support for families, good compensation to early childhood teachers, and good quality healthcare services can go a long way towards enhancing positive outcomes for children, which I believe we are all ultimately interested in. Thank you.